Bratton's Idea by Manly Wade Wellman. Old Bratton, janitor at the studios of Station 45 in Hollywood, was as gaunt as Karloff, as saturnine as Rathbone, and as enigmatic as Lugosi. He was unique among Californians, as professing absolutely no motion picture ambitions. Once, it is true, a director had stopped him on the street and offered to test him for a featured role. But old Bratton had refused with loud indignation when he heard that the role would be that of a mad scientist. Old Bratton was touchy about mad scientists, because he was one. For a time he had been a studio electrician, competent though touchy, but then it developed that he had lied about his age. He was really 80 years old, and he had been fooling with electricity ever since Edison put apparatus of various sorts within the reach of everyone. Studio rules imposed pretty strict age limits on the various jobs, and so he was demoted to a janitorship. He accepted, grumbling, because he needed money for the pursuit he had dreamed of when a boy, and maintained from his youth onward. In his little two-room apartment, he had gathered a great jumble of equipment: coils, transformers, cathodes, lenses, terminals. Some of it bought new, some salvaged from studio junk, and a great deal curiously made and not to be duplicated elsewhere, save in the eccentric mind of its maker. For old Bratton, with the aid of electricity, thought to create life. "Electricity is life," he would murmur, quoting Dr. C. W. Roebuck, who had been venerable when old Bratton was young, and again, "All these idiots think that Frankenstein is a romance, and you are a flight of fancy. But all robot stories are full of truth. I'll show them." But he hadn't shown them yet, and he was 82. His mechanical arrangements were wonderful and crammed with power. They could make dead frogs kick, dead birds flutter. They could make the metal figures he constructed, whether large or small, stir and seem about to wake, but only while the current animated them. "The fault isn't with the machine," he would say again, speaking aloud, but taking care none overheard. "It's perfect. I've seen to that. No, it's in the figures. They're too clumsy and creaky. Oh, the parts are good, but the connections are wrong somehow. Wish I knew anatomy better. And a dead body, even a fresh one, has begun dissolution. I must try and get—" Haranguing himself thus one evening after the broadcast, he pushed his mop down a corridor to the open door of a little rehearsal hall, then stopped and drew into a shadowy corner, for he had almost blundered upon Ben Gascon in the act of proposing marriage. Ben Gascon, it will be remembered, was at the time one of radio's highest-paid performers, and well worthy of his hire for the fun he made. Earlier in life, he had been a competent vaudeville artist. When, through no fault of his, vaudeville died, Gascon went into sound pictures and radio. He was a ventriloquist, adroit and seasoned by years of performance, and a man of intelligence and showmanship as well. Coming to the stage from medical school, he had constructed with his own skillful hands the small figure of wood, metal, rubber, and cloth that had become known to myriads as Tom-Tom. Tom-Tom, the impish, the witty, the leering cynic, the gusty little clown, the ironical jokester, who sat on the knee of Ben Gascon, and by a seeming misdirection of voice roused the world to laughter by his snares and sallies. Tom-Tom was so droll, so dynamic, so uproariously wicked in thought and deed, that listeners were prone to forget the seemingly quiet, grave Ben Gascon who held him and fed him solemn lines on which to explode firecracker jokes. Ben Gascon, who really did the thinking and the talking that Tom-Tom the dummy might be a headliner in the entertainment world. Not really a new thing, the combination of comedian and stooge may or may not have begun with Aristophanes in ancient Greece, but Ben Gascon was offering both qualities in his own person and in surpassing excellence. Press agents and commentators wrote fascinating conjectures about his dual personality. In any case, Tom-Tom was the making of him. It was frequently said that Gascon will be as lost without Tom-Tom as Tom-Tom without Gascon. But tonight, Ben Gascon and Tom-Tom were putting on a show for an audience of one. Shannon Cole was the prima donna and co-star of the program. She was tall, almost as tall as Gascon, and her skin was delectably creamy, and her dark hair wound into a glossy coronet of braids. Usually she seemed stately and mournful, to match the songs of love and longing she sang in a rich contralto, but now she almost groaned with laughter as she leaned above the impudent Tom-Tom, who sat on the black broadcloth knee of Ben Gascon and cocked his leering wooden face up at her. Above Gascon's tuxedo, his slender, wide-lined face was a dusky red. His lips seemed tight, even while they stealthily formed words for Tom-Tom. "Oh, Shanny!" It seemed that Tom-Tom was crooning, in that ingratiating drawl that convulsed listeners from coast to coast. "Don't you think that you and I might just slip away alone somewhere and the wooden head writhed around toward Gascon. "Get away, Gaspipe! Don't you see that I'm in conference with a very lovely lady? Can't you learn when you're not wanted?" Shannon Cole leaned back in her own chair, sighing, because she had not enough breath to laugh any more. "I never get enough of Tom-Tom," she vowed between gasps. "We've been broadcasting together for 2 years now, and he's still number one in my heart. Ben, how do you ever manage?" "Shanny," drawled the voice that was Tom-Tom's. "This idiot Ben Gascon has something to say. He wants me to front for him, but why do I always have to do the talking while he gets the profit? Speak up, Gaspipe. Who's got your tongue this time, the cat or the cat?" Shannon Cole looked at the ventriloquist and suddenly stopped laughing. Her face was pale, as his had gone red. She folded her slender hands in her lap, and her eyes were all for Gascon, though it was as if Tom-Tom still spoke. "I'll be John Alden," vowed Tom-Tom with shrill decision. "I'll talk up for this big yokel. I always do, don't I, Shanny? As Gaspipe's personal representative, engaged at enormous expense, I want to put before you a proposition, one in which I'm interested. After all, I should have a say as to who will be my stepmother." "It won't work," came the sudden savage voice of Ben Gascon. Rising, he abruptly tossed Tom-Tom upon a divan. Shannon Cole, too, was upon her feet. "Ben," she quavered. "Why, Ben!" "I've done the most foolish thing a ventriloquist could do," he flung out. "Well, if you were really serious, you didn't need to clown. You think it was fair to me?" He shook his head. "Tom-Tom's done so much of my saucy talking for me these past years that I thought I'd use him to get out what I was afraid to tell you myself," he confessed wretchedly. "Then you were afraid of me?" Shannon accused. She, too, was finding it hard to talk. Gascon made a helpless gesture. "Well, it didn't work," he groaned. "I'm sorry. You're right if you think I've been an idiot. Just pretend it never happened." "Why, Ben," she began once more and broke off. "We've just finished our last program for the year," said Ben Gascon. "Next year I won't be around. I think I'll stop throwing my voice for a while and live like a human being. Once I studied to be a doctor, perhaps once more I can—" He walked out. The rush of words seemed to have left him spiritually limp and wretched. Shannon Cole watched him go. Then she bent above the discarded figure of little Tom-Tom, who lay on his back and goggled woodenly up at her. She put a hand toward him, and her full raspberry-tinted lips trembled. Then she, too, left. And old Bratton stole from his hiding to where lay the dummy. Lifting it, he realized that here was what he wanted. Again he spoke aloud. He never held with the belief that talking to oneself is a second or third stage of insanity. "Clever one, this Gascon. This thing's anatomically perfect, even to the jointed fingers." Thrusting his arm through the slit in the back, he explored the hollow body and head. "Space for organs. Yes, every movement and reaction provided for, and a personality." He straightened up, the figure in his arms. "That's it. That's why I failed. My figures were dead before they began. But this one has life." He was muttering breathlessly. "It's like a worn shoe, or an inhabited house, or a favourite chair. You don't have to add the life force, and you don't need to stimulate what's here." Ben Gascon at the stage door had telephoned for a taxi. He turned at the sound of approaching footsteps and faced old Bratton, who carried Tom-Tom. "Mr. Gascon, this dummy." "I'm through with him," said Gascon shortly. "Then can I have him?" Tom-Tom seemed to stare at Gascon. Was it mockery or pleading in those bulging eyes. "Take him and welcome," said Gascoigne, and strode out to wait for his taxi. When old Bratton finished his cleaning that night, he carried away a bulky bundle wrapped in newspapers. He returned to his lodgings, but not to eat or sleep. First he filled the emptiness of Tom-Tom's head and body with the best items culled from his unsuccessful robots. A cunning brain device, all intricate wiring and radiating tubes, set in a mass of synthetic plasm. A complex system of wheels, switches, and tubes, in the biggest hollow where a heart, lungs, and stomach should be. Special wires of his own alloy, connecting to the ingenious muscles of rubberette that Ben Gascoigne had devised for Tom-Tom's arms, legs, and fingers. A jointed spinal column of aluminum, an artificial voice box just inside the movable jaws, and wondrous little marble-shaped camera developments for eyes, in place of the movable mockeries in Tom-Tom's sockets. It was almost dawn before old Bratton stitched up the slit in the back of Tom-Tom's little checked shirt, and laid the completed creation upon the bed-like slab that was midmost of his great fabric of machinery in the rear room. To Tom-Tom's wrists, ankles, and throat he clamped the leads of powerful terminals. With gingerly care, like that of a surgeon at a delicate operation, he advanced a switch so as to throw the right amount of current into play. The whole procession of wheeled machinery whispered into motion, its voice rising to a clear hum. A spark sprang from a knob at the top, extended its blinding length to another knob, and danced and struggled there like a radiant snake caught between the beaks of two eagles. Old Bratton gave the mechanism more power, faster and more complicated action. His bright eyes clung greedily to the little body lying on the slab. He moves, old Bratton cackled excitedly. "His wheels are going round all right. Now if only—" Abruptly he shut off the current. The machinery fell dead silent. "Sit up, Tom-Tom," commanded old Bratton harshly. And Tom-Tom sat up, his fingers tugging at the clamps that imprisoned him. The Los Angeles papers made little enough fuss of the death of old Bratton. True, he was murdered. They found him stabbed, lying face down across the threshold of his rear room that was jammed full of strange mechanical junk. But the murder of a janitor is not really big crime news in a city the size of Los Angeles. The police were baffled, more so because none of them could guess what the great mass of machinery could be, if indeed it were anything. But they forgot their concern the following week, when they had a more important murder to consider, that of one Diggs Dilson. Diggs Dilson was high in the scale of local gang authority. He had long occupied a gaudy apartment in an expensive Los Angeles hotel, which has prospered by catering to wealthy criminals. He was prudent enough to have a bedroom with no fire escape. He feared climbing assassins from without more than flames from within. In front of his locked room slept two bodyguards on cots, and his own bedside window was tightly wedged in such a fashion that no more than 5 inches of opening showed between sill and sash. The electric power line that was clamped along the brickwork just outside could hardly have supported a greater weight than 30 or 40 pounds. Yet Diggs Dilson had been killed at close range by a stab with an ordinary kitchen knife as he slept. The knife still remained in the wound, as if defying investigators to trace fingerprints that weren't there. And the bodyguards had not been wakened, and the door had remained locked on the inside. The blade of the knife, had anyone troubled to compare wounds, could have been demonstrated to be the exact size and shape as the one that had killed old Bratton. His landlord might have been able to testify that it came from old Bratton's little store of kitchen utensils, but nobody at police headquarters bothered to connect the murders of a friendless janitor and a Grand Duke of Gangdom. After considerable discussion and publicity, the investigators called the case one of suicide. How else could Diggs Dilson have received a knife in his body? Hope was expressed that the Dilson mob, formerly active and successful in meddling with film extras organizations and the seafood racket, would now dissolve. But the hope was short-lived. A spruce lieutenant of the dead chief, a man by the name of Junie Schultz, was reputed to have taken command. He appeared briefly at the auction of old Bratton's effects, buying all the mysterious machinery at junk prices and carting it away. After that, the organization, now called the Salters, blossomed out into the grim but well-paid professions of kidnapping, alien running, and counterfeiting. The first important kidnapping they achieved, that of a very frightened film director, gained them a ransom of $90,000 and the attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The victim, once released, told of imprisonment in a dank cellar, blindfolded and shackled. Once, fleetingly, he saw a captor who looked like the rogue gallery photographs of Junie Schultz, but that person was plainly not the one in authority. In fact, he seemed to listen with subtle respect to a high but masterful voice that gave orders. The owner of that high voice once came close to the chair where the prisoner sat bound. The point from which the voice seemed to issue was very, very close to the cellar floor, as though the speaker was no more than 2 feet high. An individual short and shrill. Did a child rule that desperate band? The sages of the law were more apt to consider this a clever simulation, with the order giver crouching low and speaking high, lest he be identified. A judicious dragnetting of several unsavory drinking places brought in one of the old Dilson crowd, who was skillfully, if roughly, induced to talk. He admitted a part in the kidnapping and ransom collection. He described the cellar hideout as being located in a shabby suburb. He implicated several of his comrades by name, including Junie Schultz, but he shut up with a snap when his interrogators touched on the subject of the Schultz's real chief. No, it wasn't Junie Schultz. Junie was only a front. No, nobody on the police records, but, he insisted pallidly, he wouldn't say any more. Let them kill him if they wanted to. He was through talking.
"I'd rather die in the chair this minute than get my turn with the boss," he vowed hysterically. "Don't tell me you'll take care of me either. There's things that can get between bars, through keyholes even, into the deepest hole you got, and you can smack me round all week before I'll pipe up with another word."
His captors shot him in an inside cell, generally reserved for psychopathic cases. A solidly plated cubicle with no window, grating, or other opening save a narrow ventilator in the ceiling that gave upon a 10-inch shaft leading to the roof. Then they gathered reinforcements and weapons and descended on the house with the cellar where the kidnapped director had been held for ransom. Stealthily surrounding that house, they shouted the customary invitation to surrender. Silence for a few seconds. Then a faint-hearted member of the Salters appeared at the front door with his hands up. He took a step into the open and dropped dead to the accompaniment of a pistol report from inside, and the besiegers heard the shrill voice about which they had been wondering.
"Come in and take us. This place is as full of death as a drugstore."
Followed a loud and scientific bombardment with machine guns, gas bombs, and riot guns. The mobster who had been placed on guard at the back door showed too much of himself and was picked off. A contingent of officers made a quick, planned rush. More fighting inside, with 3 more Salters dying in hot blood in the parlor and kitchen. What seemed to be the sole survivor fled to the cellar and locked himself in a rear compartment. The walls were of concrete, the one door of massive planking. The chief of the attacking force stood in front of this door and raised his voice.
"Hello in there. You're Junie Schultz, aren't you?"
Gruff was the reply.
"Whatever I am, don't try to crack in here. I'll get the first copper shows me his puss, and the second, and the third."
"You can't get us all, Junie, and we've got more men out here than you got bullets in there. Come out with your hands up while you still have the chance to stand a fair trial."
"Not me," growled Junie Schultz from within. "Come in and catch me before you talk about what kind of trial I'll get."
There was a keyhole, only partially blocked by the turnkey. One of the G-men bent and thrust in the point of something that looked like a fountain pen. Carefully he pressed a stud. The little tube spurted a cloud of tear gas through the keyhole into Junie Schultz's fortress. The besiegers grinned at each other and all relaxed to wait. The waiting was not long as it developed. Junie Schultz spoke up from within, his voice a blubber.
"Hey, I'm smothering."
"But I'm not,"
drawled the same high voice that was becoming familiar.
"Sit back, Junie, and put your head between your knees. You'll stand it better that way."
"I'm done for,"
wailed Junie Schultz.
"If they crack in, I can't see to shoot."
"I can see to shoot."
The shrill voice had become deadly.
"And you'll be the first thing I shoot at if you don't do what I tell you."
A strangled howl burst from Junie Schultz.
"I'd rather be shot than..."
The next moment he was scrabbling at the door.
"I surrender. I'll let you both in."
He turned the key in the lock just as the shot that killed him rang out. A rush of police foiled an attempt from within to fasten the door again. Sneezing and gurgling, 2 of the raiders burst into the final stronghold, stumbling over the subsiding lump of flesh that had been Junie Schultz. Blinded by tears from their own gas, they couldn't be sure afterward of what the scurrying little thing was that they saw and fired at. Those outside knew that nothing could have won past them, and the den itself had no window that was not bricked up. When the gas had been somewhat blown out, an investigator gave the place a thorough searching. Yes, there was one opening, a stovepipe hole through which a cat might have slipped. That was all, and the place was empty, but for the body of Junie Schultz. "Junie was shot in the back," announced another operative, bending to examine the wound. "I think I see what happened. Squeaky Voice was at that stovepipe hole, and plugged in from there as he tried to let us in. Then Junie tried to lock up again, just as we pushed the door open." Upstairs they went and investigated further. The hole had joined a narrow chimney with no way out, except the upper end, a rectangle 8 inches by 10. Even with 6 corpses to show, the agents returned to their headquarters with a feeling of failure. "In the morning," they promised one another, "we'll give that one Sultan we're holding another little question bee." But in the morning the jailer with breakfast found that prisoner dead. He had been caught with a noose of thin, strong cord, tightened around his throat from behind. Suicide? But the cord had been drawn into the little ventilator hole and tied to a projecting rivet far inside and above. On the same day, police, federal agents, newspapers, and the public generally were exercised by the information that Shannon Cole, popular contralto star of stage, screen, and radio, had been kidnapped from her Beverly Hills bedroom. No clues, and so the investigation turned to her acquaintances, among whom was Ben Gascon, recently retired from stage, screen, and radio. Benjamin Franklin Gascon left the office of Los Angeles Chief of Detectives, where he had spent a most trying forenoon convincing his interrogators that he had no idea why he should be brought into the case. He knew nothing of the underworld. True, he knew Miss Cole professionally, but, and his face was rueful, had no reason to count himself a really close friend of hers. He had not seen her since the termination of their latest radio assignment. His personal affairs, meanwhile, were quite open to investigation. He had grown weary of ventriloquism and had retired to live on the income from his investments. Later, he might resume his earlier profession, medicine. He was attending lectures now at the University of California in Los Angeles. And once again, he had no idea of how he was being brought into this case, or of who could have kidnapped Miss Cole. But even as he departed, he suddenly got that idea. Tum-Tum! It took moments to string together the bits of logic which brought that thought into his mind. Things had happened to people, mostly gangsters, at the hands of a malevolent creature, that is, if the creature had hands, but it must have hands, if it could wield a gun, a slipcord, a knife. It must also be notably small and nimble if it really travelled up chimneys, down ventilator shafts, along power lines, and through stovepipe holes. Gascon's imagination, as good as anyone's, toyed with a conception of a wise and wicked monkey, or of a child possessed by evil, like the children of old Salem, or a dwarf. But the point at which he coupled on his theory was the point at which police had paused, or rather begun. Diggs Dilson had been killed with a knife. So had old Bratton. He, Ben Gascon, had given old Bratton the dummy that people called Tom-Tom, and old Bratton was forthwith murdered. Gascon had meant to go to the funeral, but something had turned up to interfere. What else concerned the janitor? What, for instance, had the younger electricians and engineers teased him about so often? Electricity is life. That was old Bratton's constant claim, and he was said to have whole clutters of strange machinery at his shabby rooms. Bratton had taken Tom-Tom. Thereafter, Bratton and others had been killed. In the background of their various tragedies had lurked and plotted something small, evil, active, and strange enough to frighten the most hardened of criminals. Electricity is life, and Bratton had toiled over some kind of electrical apparatus that might or might not be new and powerful in ways unknown to ordinary electricians. Gascon left the rationalization half completed in the back of his mind, and sought out the shabby street where the janitor had lodged. The landlord would not give him much help. To be sure, old Bratton had made nuisance of himself with his machines, mumbling that they would startle the world some day. But after his death, someone had bought those machines, loaded them upon a truck, and carted them off. The landlord had seen the purchase, and later identified the purchaser from newspaper photographs as the late Junie Schultz. And Junie Schultz, pondered Gascon, had been killed by something with a shrill voice that could crawl through a stovepipe hole. "You saw the sale of the goods?" he prompted the landlord. "Was there a dummy? A thing like a big doll, such as ventriloquists use? The landlord shook his head. Nothing like that, and I've noticed if there was. So Tom, who had come home with old Bratton, had vanished. Gascon left the lodgers and made a call at a newspaper office, where he inserted a personal notice among the classified advertisements. TT, I figured you out. Clever, but your old partner can add 2 and 2 and get 4. Better let SC go. BFG. The notice ran for 3 days, then a reply in the same column. BFG. So what? TT. It was bleak, brief defiance, but Gascon felt a sudden blaze of triumph. Somehow he had made a right guess, and a most fantastic proposition. Tom had come to life as a lawless menace. All that he, Gascon, need do was act accordingly. He made plans, then inserted another message. TT, I made you, and I can break you. This is between us. Get in touch with me, or I'll come looking for you. You won't like that. BFG. Next day his telephone rang. A hoarse voice called him by his name.
Look, Gascon, you better lay off if you know what's good for you.
Ah, replied Gascon gently. Tom seems to have taken up conventional gangster methods. It means that he's afraid, which I'm not. Tell him I'm not laying off. I'm laying on. That night he took dinner at a restaurant on a side street. As he left it, 2 men sauntered out of a doorway and came up on either side of him. One was as squat and bulky as a wrestler, with a truculent square face. The other, taller but scrawny, had a broad brow and a narrow chin, presenting the facial triangle which phrenologists claim denotes shrewdness. Both had their hands inside their coats, where bulges betrayed the presence of holstered guns.
This is a stick-up, said Triangle Face. Don't make a move or a peep, or I'll cut down on you.
They walked him along the street. I'm not moving or peeping, Gascon assured them blandly. But where are you taking me?
Into this car,
replied the triangle-faced one, and opened the rear door of a parked sedan. Gascon got in, with the powerful gunman beside him. The other got into the front seat and took the wheel. No funny business, he cautioned as he trod on the starter. The boss wants to talk to you. The car drew away from the curb, heading across town. Gascon produced his cigarette case. Shannon Cole had given it to him on his last birthday, opened it, and offered it to the man beside him. Smiling urbanely at the curt growl of refusal, he then selected a cigarette and lighted it.